Welcome to Neuro Revolution. The world was not designed for us, so we are creating a new one. Hear the stories of neurodivergent entrepreneurs, creatives, and changemakers. The rebel minds changing the world.
Okay, welcome everyone who will eventually be listening to this. Today I am welcoming Bird Sellergren, who is an autism coach, doctoral student, and accessibility and inclusion consultant. They are the founder of Neurodiversity Labs and Bay Area Autism Collective, both of which I'm very excited to talk about today, as well as your journey in general. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited you're here. As I was just sort of getting to know you online and seeing the work that you're doing, I felt it was really important to get you on here and hear about that. And I have a feeling this is going to be a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, I'm
So,
looking forward to talking to you.
yeah. So maybe we could start with a little bit about your story. If you can maybe walk us through just a bit about your personal journey and how that has shaped maybe what you're doing now in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so to go way back, I'm a late diagnosed autistic person. So in school, K through 12, I didn't have an autism diagnosis. And as school progressed through the years, I started having more and more difficulties due to unrecognized learning disabilities associated with being autistic and also social challenges. And that led to me dropping out of high school as a junior. And I started in a trade and I worked in that trade for about 18 years. And while I was really successful in the business itself, I had a lot of trouble with relationships in the business. It was a male dominated business that was highly misogynistic. And so there was a lot of challenges that I faced while in that trade. And finally, I realized that I needed to move on. And so I retired and I enrolled in college. I started at community college. I transferred to UC Berkeley. I did a bachelor's in landscape architecture, still undiagnosed as autistic. And it went okay, but I knew I wanted to go on to graduate school. And I worked for a few years as a watercolor painter, kind of figuring my life out. The pandemic happened and I applied to grad school. And around that time, I was having another resurgence of social difficulties. And it was then that I got diagnosed with autism. And, it gave me the opportunity to recontextualize my whole life, understand so many of the challenges I'd had when I was younger, and also started directing my research for graduate school. So I did my graduate thesis on autistic culture and autism in the workplace. My discipline was anthropology. And one thing that I was learning a lot about and experiencing myself during that process was social isolation. And autistic people face loneliness and social isolation at incredibly high rates for multiple reasons. Part of it is due to just difficulty in relationships, also social stigma, lack of opportunities to build peer relationships. And I wanted to get involved with some local autism organizations, but I found that in the Bay Area, we had a real shortage of them, even though we have extraordinarily high rates of autistic people here because of like the STEM field and Silicon Valley. So I decided that I would start Bay Area Autism Collective, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that provides support to autistic adults through autistic-led peer support groups that are identity-based. So we offer a general social support group every Sunday. We have a group for transgender autistic people, one for autistic people who are in addiction recovery, and one for autistic people who are parents. At the same time, I started getting calls to, do some education and do some consulting work. And so I set up a side business around that same time, which I titled Neurodiversity Labs. And this year, I kind of expanded that into an autism coaching service because as I was meeting people through my nonprofit work, I was having people ask me to support them individually. And I realized that there was an opportunity there for me to provide a more individualized service to people who needed support as autistic folks, especially late diagnosed autistic folks, in navigating life in an autism affirming way, that just these supports weren't out there. So that's where I am right now. I recently started my doctoral studies in education, and my area of research is how autism specific sex ed could reduce vulnerabilities to abuse, but I'm applying a decolonial lens to this and trying to kind of unravel things from that perspective.
It's really interesting that all of these things have come out of your own personal journey. And actually, I didn't know the collective had come first. So you had the collective that you started, and then out of that, you realized there was further need. And it sounds like even on top of that, as you progress forward with your doctoral studies and your focus there, that it's all coming out of like what you're seeing and like real challenges that you want to face, and you're doing that really proactively. It's what I'm kind of seeing.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because, autistic people have a tendency to be criticized for our like kind of internalized direction. Like, the word autism comes from the Greek word auto, which is
Yeah.
self. And so people are kind of like, oh, autistic people are self-absorbed and everything. And obviously, like you said, like these initiatives and projects of mine are coming from my own experience with like abuse and vulnerabilities within the system. But I am seeing those also occur, not in isolation with me, but in the broader autism community, like on a regular basis. So whatever I can do to not just help things become more equitable for myself, but be more equitable for the autistic community as a whole seems like a really good way to spend my time.
Absolutely. Well, and there's so many pieces I would love to dive into, but I know one of the things you had mentioned is really approaching things from an autism affirming way. And so can you describe a little bit more about like what that means? What is your approach, maybe on like a practical level? Because that's one of the things I would love out of this podcast too, is that people have really like sort of actionable things of like, maybe they're autistic themselves and they are like, well, how do I do this? Or maybe they've discovered this later in life. And so like even learning about that would be super amazing.
Yeah, autism affirming work is really multifaceted and it is kind of hard to describe. But
Okay.
basically, I have autistic people in my coaching practice who are coming to me to discuss issues they have in their lives. That could be with getting work accommodations, that could be with relationships, that could be brushing their teeth. And I offer guidance on all those things while acknowledging and supporting them as autistic people. So a lot of that is about like acknowledging that the things they're experiencing are common experiences within the autistic population, and that when we look at our lives through an autistic lens rather than a neurotypical lens, we can not only support our own mental health, but teach people how to accommodate us in a day-to-day life. So a lot of it is just kind of overriding dominant narratives from the neurotypical world and using the autistic perspective to approach life. It's not always successful in terms of like how neurotypicals want us to behave, but it is successful in that it's validating to the autistic experience, and it helps autistic people who may have been told their whole life that they're just quote unquote crazy or broken, that they're not experiencing these things alone. They are having a very common autistic experience, and that can take out some of the pathology that can play
Yes.
into these internalized narratives that come from, social dominant narratives about like how we should behave.
I love that you're not trying to fit people better into the neurotypical society, but you're really sort of unpacking and probably a lot of like internalized ableism of really addressing these pieces around like, what are you expecting of yourself? That you're getting these messages to like expect them, but but maybe it's not actually something that's required of you that you really need. Like, what's going to help you personally thrive?
Yes, exactly, exactly. I think a lot of it is about helping people make themselves predictable to others in their lives. Because autistic people, one of the big challenges we have with other people is that we show up in unexpected ways for people who are not autistic. So when we can identify our own behaviors and ourselves as like authentic people, then we can teach people around us how we are as authentic people so they can show up for us. There's a lot of like inner conflict and confusion that can come with like living in non-autism affirming spaces over one's lifetime. And so you're right, we are unpacking internalized ableism in a lot of ways.
Well, and that's interesting because it's almost a multifaceted approach of learning about yourself, maybe identifying who am I? How am I, in the world in a sense, and then that piece around communicating it to other people, so presenting what the actual expectation is, and it's funny that you said helping folks become predictable to others, because I know at least in my own journey with being a late discovered ADHD person that some of the nervous system activation can come around me like feeling fear around unpredicted reactions. So like I think I'm coming off a certain way and then I get a reaction that I don't expect. And so it's really interesting that you're kind of working on the other side too of like, hey, sort of teaching people about like what to expect from you and like what it actually means.
Yeah, by when autistic people can learn how to articulate our tendencies and behaviors and just ways of showing up without that internalized ableism, we can like normalize it in an autistic scope. And by being able to articulate it, then we can explain it to others, and then it helps them be less confused, you know? And that doesn't necessarily mean that others are going to be less judgmental of us, but it does allow us the opportunity to place the ableism in their lap. We are no
Ah,
longer uh, holding on to that. We are putting it on the person whose responsibility it is to accept us. You know what I mean?
yes. Yeah, actually, that's really interesting. You're like, so let's sort of flip the script a little bit. Um, I would love to also maybe come back around as well to your journey with entrepreneurship as well as starting a 501c3. Like as an autistic person, like what has helped you in that space of entrepreneurship and nonprofit work? Because I know for a lot of autistic folks, our unemployment rates are very high, underemployment or unemployment. And so one of the things that I've seen that could be a potential opportunity is to move into entrepreneurship. It comes with its own challenges. It's also equally as difficult. So I'm just curious, as someone who is in that space doing that now, like what has really helped you to do this in a way that's really affirming of your strengths and your vision?
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. Like part of the reason why I'm doing entrepreneurship on a few different levels is because I get fired from so many jobs working for other people. And it is strictly because of my autistic tendencies, my tendency to ask questions and people think I'm challenging them, people thinking I'm insubordinate, people think I'm being intentionally obtuse. So my previous business was as a tattooer, and I'm an artist, and so I started tattooing when I was 19, and it was a really fun and fulfilling career that had me in an independent contractor box. But I was still not really treated like an independent contractor. So eventually, I decided to open my own shop, and after tattooing for over a decade, I did that. And that ability to just open my own space, see how I wanted to run things under my value system, help me not just grow my business successfully, but help me build my confidence in my abilities to establish a business and see how to do it on a scale that was um, practical. So, one of my beliefs is to just start really small, like use as little capital as possible to get yourself off the ground and grow as you have the capital accumulation to do so. So, I started off with one person in my shop. Me, as I grew, I would update the space to bring in more people, hand washing sinks, the things that were like a little bit more expensive but prohibitive in the beginning. And so when I decided to move away from tattooing in 2014, that pride and love that I had in that ownership stuck with me. And so there was like this lack of fear of failure in terms of like my future. And I worked some jobs after I got my bachelor's that were for other people, and I continued to have these problems. And so when I decided to start Bay Area Autism Collective, that was a little bit different because it is a nonprofit, and I wasn't quite sure how to do it, but I knew that I could start bare bones. And I had one other thing going for me, which is that one of my special interests is the United States tax system. So I was like, okay, I can do all this paperwork myself. Like, I understand like the concepts. I understand what I'm doing. I have a ton of friends that work in nonprofits, so I could like ask some questions. And I also have a couple people close to me that are actually professional accountants. So I just had this real perfect situation for getting myself started. And because the meetings are virtual and facilitated by autistic people, that means me, I didn't have to like have any costs up front except for like the cost of like a Zoom license, and so I could really expand as we got some donations coming in. And it's very similar with Neurodiversity Labs. Neurodiversity Labs actually technically started before Bay Area Autism Collective, but it wasn't active. And so once I started working, then it was just about like getting myself out there and offering the work and then letting the work kind of find me. And so, no costs up front. My costs up front, I think, were like my master's degree.
Sure. That could be big.
Kind of a convenient way. But my business mind was really the facilitator in that happening. And so I think that if I were to speak to the autistic and ADHD population about entrepreneurship, my biggest piece of advice would be to start really small and invest as little as possible in your idea to start growing, instead of getting held up by the idea that like I need to have like a business plan so I can get an $80,000 loan so I can do this, and then there's so much on the line. I think that one of my perspectives going into this is that no business is profitable for the first 3 years. And so, I have made sure that I have other income streams coming in while I'm building these things. And if they are successful within that timeline and earlier than I thought, that's great. But I never anticipate it. So I try to manage my expectations. I think that's like the overall message. Manage your expectations and do what's best for yourself, so you're not going to be just in a panic state needing to succeed from the get-go.
I was going to say, like, that sounds like a really reasonable approach, like starting small, making sure you're not sort of getting yourself over your head, if that makes sense, or in over your head. Because I know that myself too, with that difficulty with employment and then trying entrepreneurship. And I did have times where I was sort of just kind of jumping in, and then I would really kind of burn out or feel really overwhelmed and shut down. And so there's an element, I think, also working with your nervous system around like, is this like putting me in a place of fear and panic, like you mentioned, or is this still continuing to like inspire me forward? Yeah. I'm curious for you, have you dealt along the way with elements of burnout, and like and if so, like what was really helpful for you in coming back from that, if you are?
Yeah. So there's a couple things. Like first, I try to anticipate stuff like that. I'm in a really privileged position where I'm a student and I have a lot of flexibility, and I feel like I'm just in a position of being able to do what I love, which is generally less stressful for people. And not everyone and most people do not have that opportunity. So I want to acknowledge that. But for me, and I tell this to all my clients, anticipating your burnout, like admitting that it is going to happen is
Yeah.
part of managing it. So that might mean giving yourself permission in advance to cancel plans, being able to change your schedule and your list of demands as possible. It helps if you have a supportive family and network around you to do this. But I think that a lot of times we can be a little bit in denial about the likelihood of burnout coming on. And in that state, we're first not paying attention to the flags that appear to let us know that we're moving into burnout space. And also, we may just deny the truth and say, if I just push
Mm.
myself through today or tomorrow, then I'll be fine. Where in my life, I have a daily meditation practice that is really, really critical for my mental health. I have good meds, a great therapist. And when I start to notice that, like for instance, if I start putting on clothes and nothing feels right, like that type of sensory overload is pretty indicative that I need to rest. And if I drop something on the ground and my instinct is to just scream and shout about it because I'm so frustrated, that is an indicator that I need to rest. So I do allow myself being honest with my clients and people in my life about when I'm overstimulated. And I will tell people I had a really overstimulating couple of days and I need to reschedule our appointment. Is that okay? And I do that for a couple reasons. Obviously, it's what's best for me, but I think that that communicates to my clients or other people in my life that I really am like walking the walk. Like these
Yeah.
are the ways we can try to accommodate ourselves in our day-to-day life. That all said, I still experience burnout. And so I try to schedule that into my life. I can use my thesis writing process as an example. I knew that when I started writing my thesis, I was going to be in a heavy monotropic state where I was going to be excited and writing, and it was all I was going to be able to think about for like a week and a half. But I also knew that eventually I would be just like halted and not able to write at all. It wasn't because of lack of interest or a lack of work to do, but because that is the autistic cycle of like inertia and then no inertia. And so I built that into my calendar. I gave myself longer writing periods, but I planned on letting myself just go totally overboard when the mood felt right and then pulling back when it was not right.
And it really speaks to having a high level of self-awareness. And I'm sure that's something you have to develop over time. you know, the willingness to sort of slow down to speed up in a way, right?
Yeah.
To really be paying attention because as you were describing some of the ways in which you notice burnout coming on, they're probably very individualistic or subjective or whatever. And in that every person is going to have it a little differently. I mean, there might be some similarities, right? Like I also notice if I'm irritable, so like if I'm experiencing anger out of small things, that's a sign. and, but I love that you're willing, as you said, to walk the walk, even in what, can often for us feel like inconveniencing other people, so like really dealing with maybe the tension inside of what does it mean to allow myself to have more accessibility in my own work, which requires me taking up more space, like saying things that people might not like, which is, hey, to be here for my own health and then also for what I'm providing for you, I need to move this. And that, well, I'm just curious, like for you, was that something that was easier for you to communicate, or did you experience any, maybe anxiety around some of the first times you were like really showing up in this way, or what was your journey with that?
Yeah, I'm a classic fawner, so it was really, really
Same.
hard for me to build in this practice. And as I was talking about earlier, like putting the ableism in the other person's lap,
Yeah.
that's how I'm approaching this. Like I am really trying to deconstruct systems of power, hierarchies, and guilt around productivity. And so part of that is to offset the guilt. And that's not to say that I don't have guilt when I reschedule a client and I don't spend hours debating whether or not I'm going to send that email. But as far as like the grand scheme of things, I'm trying to align my work with my values. And if I am going to
Yeah.
say that my values are anti-ableism, I need to practice that myself. It can't be for everyone else but me. And so I try to
Mm.
live by example. And you were right when you said that this is a lot of self-awareness, and I have worked really, really hard. I am so lucky to have a fantastic therapist who has kind of prompted me to take the space to listen to my body and listen to my mind and listen to like how they do and don't communicate, because I'm seriously like interoceptive incapable. And so with my clients, that's another thing that I really encourage is stopping and paying attention to what your body is telling you and what your mind is telling you and how you're feeling in any given moment, because you're not just trying to get a message in that very moment of what you should do. You're not just trying to get the answer, but this is like
Mm.
a language with yourself that you need to practice in order to understand.
That actually really is personally helpful that you said that. You're not just looking for the answer for the thing you're supposed to do. Yes, that's very true. And I love too that you mentioned that your experience with developing that awareness wasn't in isolation completely. I mean, there are things we can do to begin to notice these things about ourselves, but I love that too about that. Like, you can have support in identifying, like, what are the signals and having maybe somebody reflect that back to you in therapy or coaching or other areas. And that can be really, really helpful because that, like you said, it can be very hard to like understand, like, not just understand, but like notice like everything that happens with interoception in your own awareness. So
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And there's something else that you saying that just kind of spurred in my mind, which is that those choices that we're making, let us see the other person in their authenticity and in how they
Mm.
respond to us setting boundaries and us like expressing ourselves authentically. And I think a lot of autistic folks spend our lives trying to figure out other people and trying to please other people. Sometimes they're not worth that effort, right? And so when we act according to our best interests and according to our value system and act authentically, and someone responds in a hostile way or in a way that is off-putting to us or really puts up some red flags, like we should listen to that. That is a person that we might want to stop investing in. And I don't think that we get that opportunity to reflect so much when we are concealing ourselves and masking ourselves as a way to make other people happy, right?
Yeah. That's a really important point. And I know it's a nuanced point too, right? Because all depending on the different identities that someone holds, like unmasking can be really threatening or unsafe. And yet, I really appreciate your challenge that in those times when you can or you want to, like allowing yourself to again sort of put it back on that other person and see what happens, and then that's information that you really need. And you know, I know it's like a difficult thing because I also definitely experienced the fawning because of how much not only is it maybe like a concern of feeling unsafe, but it's like this the intense internal reaction that's hard to deal with sensorily and otherwise, right? And so
Yeah.
I do love though that challenge because I think that can be a really important place of growth, like especially if you're wanting to take up more space, you're wanting to set these boundaries, you want that, what could come of that for you yourself, and then maybe the work that you're doing in the world. So I really appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, it's a really positive feedback loop, in my opinion, because you get that feedback to yourself that's like honest and true, and you're like, wow, this is actually working for me. And once you're putting it into practice and seeing this happen over and over, even in really small ways, it can
Mm-hmm.
really validate your experience as an autistic person, see that you're not the problem in the world, and help you continue to do these things as you move through life in like stronger, more bold ways, and read other people better, in my opinion, at least to see if they're a valuable person in your life, or to inform you on whether or not you need to reassess whether
Mm-hmm.
that relationship is mutually satisfying.
And that's really important, you know, and I do know that there's the element of the isolation that happens. And so, like, when we begin to have connections in community, there might be, for some of us, this, or at least I have experienced that, like, you want to hold on to that. But I really hear you kind of challenging that of like, is this really the person you want to hold on to or like continue to build that relationship with? And I feel like there was another thing, but I'll have to come back around to it. But maybe also speaking about that, the topic of isolation, because it's related to what you do with Bay Area Autistic Collective. Maybe we could talk a little bit about as well. You know, I know that as I was reading through your website and the things about the collective, that you're really trying to make it very intersectional in nature in like a lot of ways. And I wonder if you maybe would share a little bit more about like the vision of this collective, like how you're creating this community.
Well, the most important aspect of it is for it to be a safe space for autistic people. Um, with that comes making it a safe space for the most marginalized of autistic people. And that means autistic people of color, autistic people who may have like speech delays, autistic people who are transgender, and the people who are really struggling to find a place in society. So we practice non-judgment. People can be as autistic as they want to be, as they are, you know, in the space, and there's no one that's going to say, hey, can you say that a little quicker, or cut someone off when they're speaking, or whatever. That also means that there can be conflicts in the space because some people like to monologue, so they tend to take up too much time, or some, you know, there are autistic people that work as behavioral therapists in the ABA field, and they may be in meetings and like, you know, so there is a diplomacy to managing communities in ways that are validating to everyone and help everyone feel safe. There are times when there is one group that might not feel safe, and that is usually white cis men. And, you know, they're going to have to take one for the team on that. If they're not going to feel safe in this space, then that's not something I'm going to worry about. But, you know, my value system for BAAC is to uplift the voices who are least uplifted within the autistic community so they can feel like they have community. They are the ones that experience greater social isolation, and also normalize that there are different autistic ways of being. It's really too common for autistic people who have lower support needs not to associate with autistic people who have higher support needs. And those spaces can really easily weed out the people who need community the most. And so there's times when, as a leadership, you know, I need to push back against people's tendency to maybe even unknowingly push certain people out of the space. It also, I just want to say for the record, it's not a perfect model. You know, like there's things that happen and it's constantly evolving, but just like any type of like disability accommodations process, it is a feedback system. So, you know, I'm open to feedback. Give me feedback. I'll make adjustments. That might change something else. We need feedback on that. So it is a constantly evolving space. And I think by accepting that, it helps us be open to change and development and growth as we continue to go.
And I'm really hearing a lot of intentionality in how you're approaching this with that sort of humility of knowing it's not going to be perfect, you know, and that's really important because it keeps you open to that feedback. It sounds like that you know, this is not perfect, which means I know I can progress in some way, which means I want to hear it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With all of my businesses, I have a really strong belief that they all should be built upon value systems. And part of that is because if you establish your value system for your organization at the very beginning, it gives you something to always refer back to. But it also makes us predictable for people that want to join, and they can hold us accountable. And I think by avoiding the value system that should be integral to any organization, you're just avoiding accountability. So what you're talking about is like our essential value system and making others aware of it so they can hold us accountable, and us always holding us accountable to ourselves and our community by being able to look back at our established values and say, are we meeting these goals? This is like what we believe in. Are we actually doing this, or where can we improve, you know?
And I love that it kind of ties back to what you said about even on a individual level, where you're sort of knowing yourself and then you're communicating them. In the same way, in a larger sense, with the different organizations and businesses that you've created, you're knowing yourself, as in you're really identifying those values, and then you're communicating that for like a two-way street. It's like, so you know who I am, you can expect this, but also you can help me like live up to what I'm saying I want to live up to.
Yeah, absolutely.
What helped you identify those values? Or is it something you've just kind of like known about yourself over time or
Yeah, we're kind of justice oriented people.
yeah, yeah.
So I think my general sense of justice is rooted around my value system and vice versa. Um, Through my research as a scholar, I have been able to kind of articulate, I think, these values better. But also, a lot of my values are sort of rooted in what I don't want to do because of things that I had done to me that were really unfair, or things that I have seen done to other people that were really unfair in life. And so I can go through life and just say, wow, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. Here's what I think should happen. And then try to figure out ways to make those occur in practical senses. I mean, as a student and a scholar, like I'm really invested in like theory and the Black radical tradition and Black feminist thought and stuff like that. And so those are really strong guiding principles for me when I make choices around my value system. But also, they're all still rooted in like tearing down and challenging systems of oppression that force people into positions that are really unfair and unequal.
That makes a lot of sense, and you something that you mentioned reminded me of your website. So like I really do hope people go on there because you have a giant list of book resources, which I thought was amazing. You also briefly mentioned ABA, and you have a ton of articles, like very comprehensive, I feel like, span of articles about that as well. So since you're very research minded, if anybody wants those resources, definitely visit your universitylabs.com website.
Yeah, that's a good point that I need to update that book list. I'm a really prolific reader. Last year I read like 150 books and so I just think that there are so many answers and so many opportunities there from great thinkers, And so yeah, thank you
Yeah.
for pointing that out.
Yeah. Well, and I love that it's like somewhat easier accessible way to hear people's voices that you might not get exposed to,
Mhm.
in their writing or in the ways you can find that at the library.
Absolutely.
I love the library. Okay, so thank you so much for that. I do want to maybe hear your thoughts like around just little pieces of advice as we come towards the end of this conversation for folks who, so I know like part of my slogan is like us knowing that like we weren't made for this world, or this world wasn't made for us, so we're making a new one. Right, and these are the people I want on this podcast, like yourself, who are legitimately doing things in the world to create a different society and like opportunities. So if you had some advice for someone who did not feel like the world was made for them, and they're not just feel that, but like really experiencing that, what would your advice be to help them find their unique path? Like, what are some things they could do about this? That makes sense.
That's such a big question, and I don't want to be reductive, but I'm probably going to have to be in my answer. But what I would say, first of all, is that the world is not built for anyone who's not white, male, and European. And so that doesn't mean that your perspective and your story and your ideas aren't valid. So there are countless people out there from groups not living in the world designed for them that are thinking about liberation and emancipation. And I invite people to open themselves up to those voices so they can feel like they're not alone. Um, I think that when dominant powers tell people that their way of knowing and being is the only way, that they are not only ignorant, but they are creating harm. However, for the people who are the receiving end of that, um, who see that they want something different, there is a politicization of our identities that comes from that, that is radical, that pushes back and resists those forces. And that imagination of a future that is different for us is that is the groundwork for our culture. We
Mm.
are not just autistic, we have a culture of resistance in the autism community. And so it doesn't necessarily help the day-to-day microaggressions we experience, but to walk through life seeing these obstacles and seeing that they are not happening to us as individuals, they are happening to us as communities all over the world, can help us see that, once again, we aren't the problem.
And I love too that it sounds as well, especially from your exposure to so much different research and voices, that we're really supported by long histories of people that are showing up in this way, right? And I love too that you're inviting folks to realize that you're not alone, because that can be a really big piece too. Even just realizing like, hey, you're seeing this, you're struggling with the fact that the world wasn't designed for you, and you're not alone. And this isn't because you're the problem. And that can be really like, so essentially starting with validation can be like a really powerful thing, because like you had mentioned, I'm sure in this conversation around that message is given to us so much, right? That you're not doing it right, and you're just spending all this mental energy trying to figure out how to do it right. And you're like, well, maybe we can pull back from that and really begin to validate our own existence as
Yeah.
like the base of what we're doing.
Yeah,
um,
absolutely. We're not doing it right, but who determines what is right, you know?
right.
And
Yeah.
so
Questioning that.
so we might be doing it right for ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, right. That's even a concept.
Exactly.
And I know we've touched on this over the conversation, but maybe even just summarize maybe some of your thoughts around some practical approaches for someone to tap into their strengths. Like I know for you, you mentioned awareness, like internal awareness. You're tracking what's going on with yourself. You're setting up systems and schedules that are supporting that. Is there anything else that comes to mind around like how can you really be in a place where you're honoring your strengths?
Yeah, oh, that's such a good question. And I think that you're right. Like the self awareness is a really big part of that because you don't know your strengths if you're not practicing self awareness and actively advocating for yourself. Things just get distorted when you're not letting yourself show up authentically. So, by doing that, like that's going to be the first step. Um, Repeat the question for me so I can go to my second part because I've lost track of
Yeah.
my thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So the any practical maybe thoughts around how people can tap into their strengths, if that makes sense. And what's interesting is that you added a piece too when you said when because I was mentioning that you had mentioned awareness, and then you said also the communication. So not only is it me becoming aware of like who I am and how I am, but then actually beginning to communicate that
Yeah.
even when it's vulnerable and scary.
I remember my second part, yes,
Yeah.
and you have helped with that. So, like I said earlier, that I have a really strong daily meditation practice,
Hmm.
and a big part of my life is mindfulness meditation, and I'm getting my mindfulness meditation teacher certification right now. Mindfulness is the practice of being present by kind of stopping your brain from going off on all these little storylines and tangents and not judging yourself for your brain doing that because that's what our brains do, but bringing yourself back to the present moment and grounding yourself. And the ability to do that, to ground yourself and bring yourself back to the present moment and not get carried away in these storylines and narratives, allows you to not just internalize things that aren't necessarily real, but practice the act of like non-judgment with yourself and others. And I think that non-judgment and non-attachment is really the key to
Mm.
success in so many different aspects of life, but especially for people who are constantly being judged themselves and may have like a lot of anger in the process, and ways for us to just discontinue that narrative from like our internal space, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. Yeah. So kind of what I'm hearing you say, and I have practiced this somewhat myself too around awareness and non-judgment. That was key in my own personal journey too, to develop a sort of inner self that was a lot less judgmental than it used to be. And from that, it's almost this mechanism of noticing without the story. Or
Yeah.
noticing, even if there is a story, but just noticing there's a story. So you just keep backing up a layer and you're like, oh, I'm noticing that. I'm noticing now there's a story. I'm noticing now there's a fear because of I noticed this sensation. Like, and really just being like, okay, I'm just practicing a sense of noticing. And I love too that is a meditation in of itself. So it's not necessarily the stopping of thoughts, right? Which I think some people have as a sort of stereotype of meditation, that you're just supposed to get to like this zone of nothingness.
Which is
And
impossible.
right. But instead, it's like instead of sort of getting away from the present moment, it's almost like a real compassionate, non-judgmental moving toward the present moment. It's like, and it can be anything from like, wow, I'm noticing, some tension in my chest or something. I'm noticing I'm breathing kind of shallowly. And then like, oh, I'm noticing I have thoughts about that.
Yeah.
that maybe I shouldn't, And so like, it's a really interesting practice. And like you said, because the awareness is really key, to be able to do all the following things around like communicating who you are and the expectations and the boundary setting, like all of that kind of is set atop the foundation of awareness.
Yeah, exactly. One of the most interesting parts about like a continued mindful meditation practice for me is how much it has like desensitized me. And I
Mm.
think it's because I've kind of stopped that process of like my mind getting carried away. Now, that's not to say that I don't have ruminations and my mind doesn't get carried away, but it doesn't do it to the degree that it used to, and it used to be
Mm.
crippling for me. So being able to be desensitized to my mind's natural inclination to become hypervigilant has been really helpful. And I've actually read some research on this where, I mean, obviously, I think that the autistic community and autistic individuals could really, really benefit from this practice. But I've read some research about caretakers of autistic people who
Mm.
participate in an 8-week mindfulness meditation. I think it was just a mindfulness course, 8 weeks of a mindfulness course, and they were better regulated. And
Mm.
autistic people they were caring for were better regulated. And so there's this domino effect that happens when we can better regulate ourselves. And regulation, this type of regulation is not a denial of
Right.
yourself and your feelings and justifiable emotions around things, but it is a way to kind of keep yourself tethered so you can manage your day to day in a more functional way.
And I feel like it's also a practice of self-love because
Mm-hmm.
it's not about the denial actually, because you're getting really aware of the noticing. um, and in that, because being really dysregulated affects your body so much that in your mind and your emotions and your everything that like it is a practice that is very self-caring, to have like something that allows you to become more regulated, because it puts you more into the calm state. I can't remember what those two were called, but the stress state and the other one. um okay, well, I would love to just like in as sort of my final or about final question, around like what's your vision for this work that you're doing, as you move forward and with both of these things, if you want, or maybe just an overarching vision. I would just love to hear.
I mean, I think the overall issue is just that I want to tear the system down.
Okay.
And I want to do that however I can. So I think the fundamental approach for me to do that is to reduce vulnerability of autistic people to suffering, and that happens by reducing our tendency to fall into abusive relationships, or for us to self-criticize. And so reducing suffering is the goal, and hopefully in the process building more authentic connections and feeling happier about being my authentic self,
Yeah, I love that. That it can be a both and, like your own personal journey and like this large, huge vision. Tear it down.
Exactly.
Well, I just really want to thank you for being here. This has been such a great conversation. Maybe at some point we'll have you back, to hear updates and all the things. But I would love to know or share with the folks that are listening how they can find you. What are some great places to find you? I will have your websites in the show notes, but anything else you want to mention? I know you're on social media, or at least Threads. It's where we connected.
Yes. I'm on Threads and Instagram at Bird Sellergren. I have my Neurodiversity Labs website at www.neurodiversitylabs.com. Bay Area Autism Collective is at bayareaautismcollective.org. And other than that, if you Google me, there's other little tidbits out there that you can find. You can find my art here and there. You can find interviews that I've done, or articles about me or whatever. There's not a lot. I'm not like suggesting there's a lot, but there are some things in case you decide to take a deep dive.
I love that. You're like, just go. Here you go. Hog wild. Well, awesome. And I also want to thank my listeners for tuning in to hear from fellow rebel minds changing the world like Bird. And each of us have our unique gifts and capacities. And I hope that the stories on this podcast will support you and inspiring you on your journey and in whatever you are creating in this world, and doing that in a way where you can thrive. So thank you. And we'll be back again soon.
Thank you for having me.
Okay.